Sometimes life puts us on paths of desperation to prepare us for a greater destiny. When I knocked on that imposing mansion door, with overdue bills burning in my pocket and 2 teenage children waiting at home, I never imagined my life would change forever. Hello, my dear ones. I'm Catherine. Today I'm 70 years old, and my heart is full of stories to tell. Before I begin this story that completely changed my life, I'd like to ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's a joy to know that my stories reach so many different places. Today I'm going to tell you how I went from desperation and humiliation to finding a purpose I never knew existed in the beautiful city of Charleston, South Carolina. This story begins on a sweltering March day in 1998, when the scent of jasmine in the air contrasted with the tightness in my chest of someone who didn't know how to pay rent at the end of the month. I was 45 years old, recently divorced, with my pride wounded and my bank account empty. Robert, my ex-husband, had left me for a younger woman, taking not only my heart, but also most of our savings. Sarah, my 18-year-old daughter, was trying to get into art school, while Michael, at 16, was beginning to resent our new reality. The modest apartment we'd moved to after selling our family home felt like a constant reminder of my failures. That morning I saw an ad in the Charleston Post and Courier. Companion needed for elderly lady. Live-in position. Serious inquiries only. The address was in the historic district, where antebellum mansions stood like guardians of old Southern aristocracy. I knew this was my chance, perhaps my only chance, to provide for my children and regain some stability. The 3-story mansion rose before me like an abandoned castle. Spanish moss hung from ancient oak trees, creating dancing shadows on the weathered facade. The garden, once magnificent, now showed signs of neglect, though someone still maintained the basic structure. My hands trembled as I pressed the ornate doorbell, hearing its echo inside what seemed like an empty house. The woman who opened the door was not at all what I expected. Evelyn Hartwell, at 82, stood erect as a military officer, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, wearing a navy blue dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her pale blue eyes scrutinized me with the intensity of someone accustomed to command. "You're 20 minutes late," she said without preamble, checking a gold watch on her thin wrist. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hartwell. I had trouble finding parking and—" "I don't want excuses. I want punctuality. Come in." The house's interior took my breath away. Crystal chandeliers hung from decorated ceilings. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings in gilded frames adorned the walls. But despite all the luxury, there was something melancholic about the place, as if beauty couldn't hide a deep sadness. Mrs. Hartwell led me to a sitting room where sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, creating a golden, almost ethereal atmosphere. She sat in a high-backed chair like a throne, while I remained standing until she gestured for me to sit. "Tell me about yourself, Mrs.—" She paused, waiting. "Williams, Catherine Williams. I have 2 children, Sarah and Michael. I've been divorced for 8 months, and I need this job." I decided honesty was the best approach. "At least you're direct. I detest people who beat around the bush." She studied me for a long moment. "I live alone by choice. I don't want conversations during meals, visits without prior authorization, or anyone touching my personal belongings. I wake at 6 in the morning and expect breakfast at 7 sharp, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. I have specific dietary requirements that will be explained to you. Do you have any questions? What exactly would my responsibilities be? Ensuring I take my medications, preparing meals, light housekeeping, and being available if I need assistance. Nothing more, nothing less. The salary is $2,000 a month, plus room and board. You'll have Sundays off and can visit your children, though I prefer you don't bring them here. $2,000 was more than I had hoped for. It would solve our immediate problems and give me time to plan our future. But something in Mrs. Hartwell's tone, in the way she emphasized her rules, made me realize this wouldn't be easy. "I accept," I said without hesitation. "Good. You'll start tomorrow. I'll show you to your room." The room she assigned me was on the second floor, spacious and well-furnished with a view of the garden. It was larger than the living room of our current apartment. As I looked out the window, I saw Mrs. Hartwell walking toward a greenhouse in the back of the property, moving with surprising agility for her age. That first night, lying in the comfortable bed, I wondered what I had gotten myself into. The house was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. Outside, Charleston's night sounds filtered through the windows. Distant jazz music, laughter from nearby restaurants, the occasional clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages taking tourists through the historic district. I thought about Sarah and Michael sleeping in our small apartment. Sarah was working part-time at a coffee shop, dreaming of art school, but knowing we couldn't afford it. Michael was becoming increasingly rebellious, skipping classes and staying out late. I needed this job to work, not just for me, but for them. The next morning, I woke before the alarm, nervous about my first day. I found Mrs. Hartwell already in the kitchen, dressed and ready, checking her watch with obvious disapproval. 6:58, she announced. Breakfast should have been ready 2 minutes ago. I quickly prepared the breakfast she had specified: fresh fruit, whole grain toast, and Earl Grey tea, served on fine china that probably belonged to her family for generations. She ate in complete silence, reading a section of the Wall Street Journal while I stood nearby, unsure of what to do. After breakfast, she handed me a detailed list of daily tasks and dietary restrictions. Her handwriting was perfect, as precise as her speech. As I read through the requirements, I realized Mrs. Hartwell wasn't just particular. She was someone who maintained absolute control over every aspect of her life. "Questions?" she asked, though her tone suggested she expected none. "Just one. The greenhouse in the garden. Is that off limits too?" For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or discomfort. "Yes," she said curtly. "Everything in this house has its place, Mrs. Williams. And some places are not meant for others." As the days passed, I began to understand the rhythm of Mrs. Hartwell's life. She was a creature of absolute routine, but I noticed small details that intrigued me. She always paused before a particular portrait in the hallway, a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Sometimes I caught her staring out the window toward the greenhouse, her expression softening in a way that made her seem almost vulnerable. The loneliness in that house was palpable. Mrs. Hartwell received few phone calls and no visits. When the phone did ring, she usually let it go to the answering machine, listening as relatives left brief, dutiful messages, asking about her health but never proposing to visit. It was during my second week that I first heard her crying. I was finishing the dinner dishes when a terrible storm hit Charleston. The lights flickered and finally went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I found some candles and was making my way upstairs when I heard soft sobbing coming from Mrs. Hartwell's room. I knocked gently on the door. "Mrs. Hartwell, are you all right?" "Go away," came the muffled response. But something in her voice, a vulnerability I had never heard before, made me ignore her command. I pushed the door open slightly and saw her sitting on the bed, illuminated by lightning flashes, holding something against her chest. "Please," I said softly, "let me help." In the candlelight, I could see she was holding an old porcelain doll, its delicate features and lace dress suggesting it was very old and very precious. Tears streamed down Mrs. Hartwell's face as she rocked gently, as if comforting a real child. "She was so small," Mrs. Hartwell whispered, not looking at me. "So perfect, so beautiful. 3 years old. The doctor said there was nothing they could do." I sat carefully on the edge of the bed, not speaking, just being present. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer is simply our presence in someone else's pain. Her name was Margaret, Maggie. She loved this doll more than anything in the world. Mrs. Hartwell's voice was barely audible above the storm outside. When we lost her, I couldn't bear to put the doll away. It's all I have left of her laughter, her little hands. My heart broke for this woman who had hidden such profound pain behind her cold facade. I understood now why she lived in such isolation, why she controlled every aspect of her life so rigidly. It was her way of protecting herself from more loss. She must have been very special, I said gently. Mrs. Hartwell looked at me for the first time since I had entered the room. In the flickering candlelight, I saw not the austere woman who gave orders, but a mother who had lost the most precious thing in the world. She was everything, she whispered. And when God took her from me, I swore I would never let anyone hurt me like that again. We sat together in silence until the storm passed and the lights came back on. Mrs. Hartwell carefully placed the doll in a drawer, composing herself with the dignity that seemed as natural to her as breathing. "This doesn't leave this room," she said, but her tone lacked its usual authority. "Of course not," I replied. From that night forward, something shifted between us. Mrs. Hartwell didn't become warm overnight, but the sharp edges of her commands softened slightly. She began leaving the newspaper's art section on the kitchen counter where I could read it, and once I caught her watching me tend to some wilted flowers, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I started leaving small notes next to her breakfast, nothing elaborate, just, "Have a beautiful day," or, "The garden looks lovely this morning." At first, she threw them away without comment, but eventually I noticed she had started reading them before discarding them. One morning, I found a note beside the coffee pot, written in her perfect handwriting. "The Earl Grey needs to steep exactly 4 minutes, not 3. E.H." It was the first time she had signed anything with her initials rather than her full name, and somehow it felt like a small step toward friendship. The second month brought unexpected changes. I had started studying French using books I found in Mrs. Hartwell's extensive library, hoping to surprise her. I had overheard her speaking to someone on the phone in what sounded like perfect French, though she had never mentioned speaking the language. One morning, as I served her breakfast, I gathered my courage and said, "Bonjour, Madame Hartwell. J'espère que vous avez bien dormi." She nearly dropped her teacup, staring at me with surprise and something that might have been pleasure. "Votre accent est terrible," she replied, but I caught the hint of a smile. "Where did you learn French? From your books? I hope you don't mind. I've always wanted to learn, and you have such a wonderful collection." For the first time since I had known her, Mrs. Hartwell looked truly interested in something I had to say. "I taught French literature for 15 years before I married," she said quietly. "At the College of Charleston. I haven't spoken it with anyone in, well, many years. Would you help me with my pronunciation?" She considered this for a long moment. "Perhaps," she said finally, "but only if you're serious about learning properly. I won't waste time with someone who isn't committed." And so began our French lessons, conducted over morning coffee. Mrs. Hartwell was a demanding teacher, correcting my every mistake, but I could see the joy in her eyes as she shared her knowledge. She told me about her years teaching, about students who had become writers and diplomats, about the poetry of Baudelaire and the novels of Proust. For the first time since her husband's death, Mrs. Hartwell had someone to share her passion with, and for me, learning French became a bridge to understanding this complex woman who was slowly becoming more than just an employer. However, not everything was improving. My children were struggling with my absence. Sarah had to work more hours to help with expenses, which meant less time for her art. Michael had started skipping school and his grades were suffering. When I called them on Sunday afternoons, the conversations were tense. "Mom, when are you coming home?" Michael asked during one particularly difficult call. "I hate it here without you." I know, sweetheart. But this job is helping us get back on our feet. Just a little longer. You're choosing some rich old lady over your own family, Sarah said bitterly. Dad was right about you. Her words stung because part of me feared they might be true. Was I abandoning my children when they needed me most? But every time I considered quitting, I thought about our unpaid bills, about Sarah's dreams of art school, about the stability this job provided. Mrs. Hartwell, with her sharp perception, noticed my distress after these phone calls. Family troubles? She asked one Sunday evening, finding me crying quietly in the kitchen. I told her about my children's resentment, about the guilt that was eating at me. To my surprise, she listened without judgment. Bring them here next Sunday, she said finally. But you said... I know what I said, but rules can sometimes be adjusted. She paused, looking uncomfortable with her own generosity. For Sunday dinner. Nothing more. That next Sunday, Sarah and Michael arrived at the mansion with obvious reluctance. Sarah kept her arms crossed, ready for battle, while Michael stared at everything with wide eyes, intimidating by the grandeur. Mrs. Hartwell greeted them with the same formal politeness she showed everyone, but I noticed she had prepared a special meal, roast beef with all the trimmings, and even a chocolate cake for dessert. During dinner, something magical happened. Mrs. Hartwell began asking Sarah about her art, and my daughter, despite her initial hostility, found herself describing her passion for painting. To my amazement, Mrs. Hartwell listened with genuine interest. Show me, Mrs. Hartwell said suddenly. I'm sorry, Sarah replied, confused. Your art. Show me something you've painted. Sarah reluctantly pulled out her phone and showed some photos of her work. Mrs. Hartwell studied them carefully, and I could see my daughter holding her breath, waiting for judgment. You have talent, Mrs. Hartwell said finally. Real talent. But you need proper training. We can't afford art school, Sarah said defensively. Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I once knew someone at the Savannah College of Art and Design. Perhaps it's time I renewed some old acquaintances. I stared at her in shock. Was she really considering helping Sarah? Michael, meanwhile, had been exploring the house with the curiosity of a typical teenager. He returned to the dining room full of questions about the history of the mansion, the antiques, the architecture. Mrs. Hartwell found herself telling stories about Charleston's past, about the house's previous owners, about hurricanes and wars and the changing times. For the first time in months, I saw my children animated and engaged. And Mrs. Hartwell, usually so reserved, seemed to bloom under their attention. After they left, the house felt different, less like a museum and more like a home. Your children are intelligent, Mrs. Hartwell commented as we cleaned up. The girl has exceptional artistic vision. The boy asks good questions. Thank you for being kind to them. I wasn't being kind, she said in her matter-of-fact way. I was being honest, but I knew better. Kindness was exactly what it had been, even if Mrs. Hartwell wasn't ready to admit it. True to her word, Mrs. Hartwell contacted her friend at SCAD. Within a week, Sarah had been invited for a portfolio review and interview. The possibility of a scholarship suddenly seemed real. As spring turned to summer, our relationship continued to evolve. Mrs. Hartwell began sharing more stories about her past, about her late husband, who had been a respected judge, about her years teaching, about the daughter she had lost so many years ago. In return, I found myself confiding in her about my marriage, about the betrayal I had felt when Robert left, about the fears that kept me awake at night. You blame yourself for his leaving, she observed one evening as we sat on the screened porch, watching fireflies dance in the garden. Don't I deserve some blame? Perhaps, but not all of it, and certainly not enough to destroy your sense of worth. She was quiet for a moment. I blamed myself when Maggie died. If only I had noticed the symptoms sooner, if only I had insisted on different doctors, if only I had prayed harder. But that wasn't your fault. No, it wasn't. Just as your husband's character flaws aren't yours. She looked at me directly. You're a good woman, Catherine. Don't let his failures define your future. It was the first time she had used my first name, and somehow, it felt like a benediction. Summer brought its own challenges. The heat was oppressive, and Mrs. Hartwell's health seemed to suffer in the humidity. She became more tired, more fragile, though she fought against showing any weakness. One particularly hot afternoon, I found her collapsed in the greenhouse, overcome by the heat. I helped her inside, got her cooled down, and called her doctor. She was fine, just dehydrated and overheated. But the incident scared both of us. You shouldn't be working in that greenhouse during the heat of the day, I scolded her as she recovered. Those orchids need daily attention, she protested weakly. Then I'll help you. But early morning or evening only. She started to object, then stopped. You don't know anything about orchids. Then teach me. And so I was finally admitted to Mrs. Hartwell's secret sanctuary. The greenhouse was her pride and joy, filled with dozens of exotic orchids in every color imaginable. Some were blooming, others dormant, but all were tended with meticulous care. My husband built this for me as an anniversary present, she explained as she showed me around. He said if I was going to spend all my time talking to flowers, I might as well have the finest ones available. Each orchid had a story, a history. She remembered where and when she had acquired each one, which ones were particularly challenging to grow, which ones held special meaning. It was a living museum of her passions and memories. Working together in the greenhouse became our favorite time of day. In the early morning or late evening, when the heat was bearable, we would water, prune, and nurture these beautiful creatures. Mrs. Hartwell was patient with my inexperience, teaching me about humidity, light, fertilizers, and the subtle signs of disease or stress. Orchids are like people, she said one evening, as we misted the cattleyas. They're resilient, but they need the right conditions to flourish. Too much attention can kill them just as surely as neglect. I wondered if she was talking about herself as much as the flowers. It was in the greenhouse that Mrs. Hartwell told me about the room upstairs that I had sometimes heard her moving around in, but had never seen. There's something I want to show you, she said one evening as we finished our orchid care. Something I haven't shown another living soul. We climbed to the 3rd floor, past the main bedrooms, to a door I had always assumed was a storage closet. Mrs. Hartwell produced a key from a chain around her neck and unlocked it. Inside was a nursery, perfectly preserved as if waiting for a child who would never come. A white crib with delicate mobile hanging above it. A rocking chair by the window. Shelves lined with toys and books. But what caught my attention were the dozens of baby clothes, still in their packages. Gifts never opened. Hope preserved in tissue paper and ribbons. I kept buying things, Mrs. Hartwell said quietly. After Maggie died, I couldn't stop. Every time I saw something beautiful, something she would have loved, I bought it. I told myself it was in case we had another child, but we never did. The room was a shrine to dreams deferred, to the family that might have been. I could feel the weight of all those years of secret hoping, of grief transformed into ritualized purchasing. Why are you showing me this? I asked gently. Because you need to know. About who I really am. About why I've lived the way I have. She touched the railing of the crib with reverent fingers. Your children are so alive, so full of possibility. I had forgotten what that looked like until they started visiting. We stood together in that room of suspended time, and I understood that Mrs. Hartwell wasn't just sharing her past with me. She was trusting me with her deepest vulnerabilities. What do you want to do with all of this? I asked. She was quiet for a long time. I don't know, she said finally. I've kept it all for so long. I don't know how to let it go. Maybe you don't have to let it all go. Maybe you could share some of it. She looked at me questioningly. There's a children's charity in Charleston, isn't there? Some of these things could bring joy to families who need them. The idea seemed to both terrify and intrigue her. I'll think about it, she said. As summer faded into fall, Mrs. Hartwell did more than think about it. She began carefully selecting items from the nursery to donate, keeping only the most precious mementos of Maggie. It was a slow, emotional process, but each donation seemed to lift some weight from her shoulders. Sarah received her scholarship to SCAD and would start in the spring semester. Her joy and gratitude toward Mrs. Hartwell was touching to see. Michael's grades had improved dramatically since the Sunday dinner started, and he had developed a genuine affection for Mrs. Hartwell, bringing her small gifts and telling her about his school projects. But just as life seemed to be settling into a good rhythm, Robert reappeared. I was in the garden with Mrs. Hartwell one afternoon when I saw him walking up the front path. My heart sank as I recognized his familiar swagger, the way he held his shoulders when he was preparing for a confrontation. "Catherine!" he called out, his voice carrying the false heartiness he used when he wanted something. "You look good. This rich lady lifestyle must agree with you." Mrs. Hartwell, who had been reading quietly on the garden bench, looked up with sharp interest. I had told her about Robert, but she had never seen him. "What do you want, Robert?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "To see my children, of course, and to talk to you about this new arrangement of yours." He looked around appreciatively at the mansion and grounds. "Living pretty high on the hog now, aren't you? While our kids are stuck in that little apartment. The children are fine, and they see me every Sunday. That's not enough, Catherine. A judge might say you've abandoned your parental responsibilities. Might think the kids would be better off with their father." The threat was clear, and we both knew it. Mrs. Hartwell had been listening to this exchange with growing displeasure. "And you are?" she asked Robert in her most imperious tone. "Robert Williams, Catherine's husband." "Ex-husband," I corrected quickly. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, not offering her hand. "And you're threatening my employee because—" Robert was clearly taken aback by her directness. "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm just concerned about my children's welfare." "I see. And what precisely have you been doing to ensure their welfare over the past year?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Robert had been sporadic with child support, and even more sporadic with visits. "That's between Catherine and me," he said defensively. "Actually," Mrs. Hartwell said, rising from the bench with regal dignity, "it's not. If you're planning legal action against someone in my employ, it becomes my concern as well. Catherine, I think we should contact my attorney." "That's not necessary," I started to say, but Mrs. Hartwell silenced me with a look. "Oh, but I think it is. You see, Mr. Williams, I happen to be a retired member of the South Carolina Bar myself, and I find your tactics rather unsavory." Robert's bluster deflated somewhat. He hadn't expected to face a formidable opponent. "I just want what's best for my kids," he said weakly. "Then I suggest you start paying consistent child support and making regular visits. That would demonstrate genuine concern for their welfare." Mrs. Hartwell's voice could have cut glass. "Good day, Mr. Williams." Robert left without another word, but I knew this wasn't over. He had looked desperate in a way that frightened me. That evening, Mrs. Hartwell made some phone calls. By the next morning, she had arranged for me to meet with one of Charleston's most respected family law attorneys. "But I can't afford—" "It's handled," she said firmly. "No one threatens my people." The phrase, "my people," stayed with me. Somehow, without either of us quite realizing it, I had become one of her people, and she was fiercely protective of those she cared about. The legal consultation revealed that Robert's threats were largely empty. My job with Mrs. Hartwell actually demonstrated stability and financial responsibility. The attorney also discovered something troubling. Robert was in serious debt, owing money to several creditors and possibly worse. He's desperate, the attorney warned me. Desperate people do unpredictable things. Be careful. As if to prove the attorney's point, Robert showed up at the mansion again a few days later, this time clearly intoxicated and belligerent. I know you have money now, Catherine. He slurred from the front porch. That old woman's probably loaded. You could help your children's father out of a tight spot. Mrs. Hartwell called the police without hesitation. Robert was arrested for trespassing and public intoxication, which only added to his legal troubles. I'm sorry you had to deal with that, I told Mrs. Hartwell afterward. I'm not, she replied firmly. I'm glad I could help. Family protects family. Again, that word, family. We had become family. This unlikely pair of women from different worlds, different generations, different backgrounds. As Christmas approached, Mrs. Hartwell began planning something special. She had always ignored the holidays since her husband's death, but this year she wanted to celebrate. I'm hosting Christmas dinner, she announced one morning in early December. I want you to invite your children, of course, but I'm also inviting some other people. She had contacted former students, neighbors, anyone who might be alone for the holidays. The guest list grew to 15 people, and the house began buzzing with preparation. Mrs. Hartwell threw herself into the planning with an energy I hadn't seen before. She ordered new china, had the house professionally decorated, and spent hours planning the menu. It was as if she was making up for years of solitary holidays. Christmas Eve arrived with a light dusting of snow. Unusual for Charleston, but magical nonetheless. The house glowed with lights, and the scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air. Our guests began arriving in the early afternoon, and the house that had been silent for so long echoed with laughter and conversation. Mrs. Hartwell was in her element, the perfect hostess, gracious and charming with everyone. Sarah arrived with a special gift for Mrs. Hartwell, a painting she had done of the mansion and garden. It was beautiful, capturing not just the physical details, but the sense of peace and renewal that the place represented. Mrs. Hartwell was visibly moved. "It's perfect," she said, her voice husky with emotion. "I'll hang it in the front hall where everyone can see it." Michael had brought his camera and was documenting the evening, capturing candid moments of joy and connection. One of my favorite photos from that night shows Mrs. Hartwell laughing at something one of her former students had said, her face radiant with happiness. As the evening wound down and our guests began to leave, Mrs. Hartwell pulled me aside. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For giving me back my life." But I knew the truth was more complex than that. We had given each other back our lives, each filling a void the other hadn't even known existed. That winter was one of the happiest times I had ever experienced. Mrs. Hartwell and I had settled into a comfortable routine that felt less like employer and employee, and more like family. She continued to help with my French, and I had become quite accomplished with the orchids. But in February, something changed. Mrs. Hartwell began having episodes of confusion, times when she would forget where she was or what she was doing. At first, I thought it was just occasional senior moments, but they became more frequent and more troubling. One morning, I found her standing in the kitchen, still in her nightgown, looking completely lost. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. "You're home, Mrs. Hartwell. You're in your kitchen. Who are you?" The question pierced my heart. "I'm Catherine. I take care of you." She stared at me for a long moment, then slowly recognition returned to her eyes. "Catherine? Yes, of course. I'm sorry, I was just confused for a moment." I convinced her to see her doctor, who ran a series of tests. The results were what I had feared. Early-stage dementia. Possibly Alzheimer's. The progression was unpredictable, but it would get worse. Mrs. Hartwell took the news with characteristic dignity. "How long do I have?" she asked the doctor. "It's impossible to say. With proper care, you could have several good years, but you'll need increasing assistance as time goes on." That evening, we sat in the greenhouse among her beloved orchids, processing the diagnosis. "I want you to know something," Mrs. Hartwell said. "I've changed my will. I'm leaving half of everything to you and your children." I was stunned. "Mrs. Hartwell, you don't need to." "Yes, I do. You've become the daughter I never had the chance to watch grow up. Your children have given me grandchildren when I thought I'd never have that joy. This house, these things, they mean nothing without people to love them. But your nephews..." "My nephews have shown no interest in my welfare for years. They call dutifully on holidays but never visit. You've been my family when I needed it most." I was overwhelmed by her generosity, but also worried about the implications. "Won't they contest it?" "Let them try. I'm still mentally competent, and I have an excellent attorney." Her smile was mischievous. "Besides, I've documented every neglectful moment, every missed visit, every perfunctory phone call. They'll have a difficult time proving they deserve anything." The spring passed quietly, with Mrs. Hartwell having good days and bad days. On the good days, she was almost her old self, sharp, witty, engaged. On the bad days, she struggled to remember basic things, sometimes not recognizing me at all. But even as her mind began to fail, her heart remained strong. She never lost her love for the orchids, for Sarah's art, for Michael's enthusiastic stories about school. Love, it seemed, was the last thing to go. Sarah started at SCAD and was thriving. She called regularly, always asking about Mrs. Hartwell and sharing stories about her classes and new friends. Michael had discovered a passion for architecture, inspired by all the historical buildings Mrs. Hartwell had taught him about. In May, Mrs. Hartwell's nephews arrived unannounced. They had somehow learned about the new will and were not pleased. "Aunt Evelyn," said the older one, James, "we need to talk about this situation with your companion." Mrs. Hartwell's back straightened, and I saw a flash of her old steel. "There's nothing to discuss. Catherine is family. She's an employee who's obviously taken advantage of your kindness," said the younger nephew, Paul. "We think you should reconsider your recent decisions." "What I think," Mrs. Hartwell said coldly, "is that you should leave my house immediately." But they had planted seeds of doubt that would soon grow into a full legal challenge. Within weeks, they had filed papers contesting the will, claiming Mrs. Hartwell was not competent to make such decisions. The legal battle was draining and ugly. The nephews painted me as a gold digger who had manipulated a lonely old woman. They brought in doctors who questioned Mrs. Hartwell's mental state, lawyers who twisted every act of kindness into evidence of manipulation. But Mrs. Hartwell had allies too. Her former students, her doctor, even some of her neighbors testified to her mental clarity and to the positive changes they had witnessed in her life since I arrived. Sarah and Michael spoke eloquently about how Mrs. Hartwell had become their grandmother in every way that mattered. The judge, after hearing all the evidence, ruled in our favor. Mrs. Hartwell's will would stand. The nephew's neglect over the years had been well documented, while my care and devotion were obvious to everyone. But the victory came at a cost. The stress of the legal battle accelerated Mrs. Hartwell's decline. By autumn, she was having more bad days than good ones. I hired additional help so I could continue caring for her properly. She deserved to spend her remaining time in the house she loved, surrounded by her orchids and her memories. One evening in November, as I was helping her get ready for bed, she suddenly looked at me with perfect clarity. "Catherine," she said, "I want you to know that these have been the happiest years of my life since Maggie died. You brought light back into this house, laughter back into my days. You gave me a family when I thought I was destined to die alone. You gave me a family too," I replied, tears streaming down my face. "You saved us, all of us." "We saved each other," she corrected gently. Mrs. Hartwell passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 days before Christmas. 2.5 years after I had first knocked on her door. I found her in the morning, looking serene and younger somehow, as if death had erased the lines of pain and loneliness that life had carved into her face. The funeral was well attended. Former students, neighbors, and friends filled the church, all sharing stories of the remarkable woman who had touched their lives. Sarah created a beautiful memorial display using photos Michael had taken over the past 2 years, showing Mrs. Hartwell in her garden, with her orchids, laughing with my children, surrounded by the family she had chosen. The house felt impossibly empty without her, but it was still home. The orchids still needed tending, and somehow their care connected me to her memory. Sarah came home from school to help me process everything, and Michael spent hours in the greenhouse, learning to care for the plants that had meant so much to the woman who had become his grandmother. The inheritance changed our lives in practical ways. Sarah could finish school without financial worry. Michael could pursue his architectural dreams, and I could return to school myself to become a registered nurse, inspired by my years of caregiving. But the real inheritance was intangible. The knowledge that love doesn't require blood relations, that family is something you create as much as something you're born into, that even in the darkest times, human connection can transform everything. Mrs. Hartwell had left us more than money and property. She had left us the understanding that every person deserves dignity, compassion, and the chance to matter to someone else. She had shown us that it's never too late to open your heart, to forgive past hurts, to create new relationships that nourish the soul. Today, when I tend her orchids in the greenhouse we shared, I can almost hear her voice correcting my technique, see her smile when a particularly stubborn bloom finally opens. The mansion is full of life now. Sarah visits regularly with her art friends. Michael brings his girlfriend to Sunday dinners, and I've started hosting the community French conversation group Mrs. Hartwell had always talked about starting. Sometimes I think about that desperate woman who knocked on this door all those years ago, worried about overdue bills and ashamed of her failures. I want to tell her that sometimes what looks like the end is actually the beginning, that the courage to ask for help can lead to discoveries you never imagined. Mrs. Hartwell taught me that grace comes in unexpected forms, that healing happens when you least expect it, and that the capacity for love expands to fill whatever space you give it. She showed me that home isn't just a place you come from. It's a place you create with the people who choose to love you. Thank you so much for making it to the end. I hope my story touched your heart. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video. It helps us so much. Every day we bring new emotional stories about life, so feel free to explore and find your favorite. And of course, we want to know your opinion. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments. We'll see you tomorrow with another incredible story.